What's up, you guys, and welcome back to the Kingdom Culture Podcast, where we are helping God's people to keep the course in an opposing world. Today we are on episode 2 of our current season that is called Women of the Word. And so in this season, we are taking 4 episodes to shine a spotlight on women in Scripture who don't always get the attention that they deserve. But these are women whose faith and their obedience shaped history. These are women who modeled courage and conviction and devotion to God, even in some really difficult circumstances. And so today we're going to be talking about our second woman of the Word on this season, and her name is Hannah, and she is the mother of Samuel. Hannah's story is actually found in 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2, and it is a very powerful example of prayer and surrender and God's faithfulness in her life. So we're going to get into it today. But to kind of set the scene, we have to understand what is going on in Hannah's life at this period. So the book of 1 Samuel opens with a family, and it starts with a man named Elkanah, and he has 2 wives who are named Peninnah and Hannah. Now, immediately we know there's probably going to be a little bit of drama, because when there's someone in Scripture with multiple wives, normally there's a little bit of tension. If there's anybody you know with multiple wives, I'm sure they got tension going on. Like, anytime in the Bible that we see this, there's usually some kind of like baby mama drama happening in the background. And so we already know, setting the scene for this, there's probably going to be some crazy things happening. And so here in this story, the tension is very clear. And it is that Peninnah has children and Hannah has none. And so in ancient Israel, this was not just something about family dynamics. This was actually more like their identity. Children meant legacy and security and blessings. And so to be a barren woman was to carry a lot of shame around with you. And so Peninnah does not make this situation for Hannah any easier. And so 1 Samuel 1, 6-7 says this: "Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year." And so Hannah isn't just dealing with this disappointment. She's dealing with open humiliation. And every year, every trip to worship, Peninnah continues to rub it into Hannah's face, okay? And so verse 7 tells us that Hannah wept and would not eat. Right? And this is grief that goes beyond words. But actually, like, if we were to put this into our modern day context, Hannah was practicing forms of self-harm, right? Like not eating and being so depressed that she was unable to eat. She was practicing modern day things that we identify with, things like maybe an eating disorder, but you know, what it's written as in Scripture is she was weeping and would not eat. And so we know that Hannah was very grieved by her situation. And so one of these years, Hannah's pain kind of boils over, and she goes to the tabernacle at Shiloh and she pours her heart out to God. So in verse 10, it explains that in her deep anguish, Hannah begins praying to the Lord and just weeping bitterly. And I really love in this passage how raw this is, how real this is. Hannah's entire story. She's not holding back in this prayer. She's not, praying these polite or rehearsed or memorized prayers. She is desperate in her situation. And she makes this vow in this prayer. She says that if God would only look upon her misery and remember her and give her a son, then she would give him back to the Lord for all of the days of his life, right? So she prays this prayer of totally being willing to surrender her son to God if God would just bless her with this son. And so this is huge because, she's saying, God, if you will answer me, the gift that you are going to give me, I won't keep it for myself. I will release him back to you. And so here's where things kind of start to get interesting. Eli, who is the priest, is present, and he sees her praying and moving her lips and doing her whole prayer. Like it says, she's weeping, right? She's kind of a little undignified in this prayer, right? Like Hannah is taking this to the feet of the Lord. And so Eli sees this, and because of her prayer, because of the state that she's in, instead of realizing that she's praying, Eli assumes that Hannah must be drunk, right? Okay, and so in verse 14, he says, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." Imagine this, imagine being in the middle of your most vulnerable moment with God, right? Like she is poured out, she is low down, she is just praying, just begging, just crying out to God. And the priest comes up, he pulls up and he's like, "Girl, quit drinking. Girl, get up." You know what I mean? So Hannah is in the middle of this position. And so, she is being accused almost of being wasted while she's really sitting here praying. And so Hannah actually responds with grace in this scenario, which is impressive, right? If I'm sitting here praying a really heartfelt prayer to God and somebody says, girl, you're drunk, I'm probably going to take it a little bit to heart, right? Because, I'm trying to have this moment with my Lord. But Hannah responds with grace in this. And she tells him, this is not so. I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. This is not the situation. And so Eli kind of backs off and he says, go in peace and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. And so here is my favorite part of this passage that really speaks to me. And I think that it will mean something significant to you too. She says in verse 18, or the verse says in verse 18, her face was no longer downcast. And I think this is significant and cool and interesting because at this point in the story, there is a miracle that's going to come. But at this point, the miracle had not even happened yet. Samuel, her son, had not been born. But yet, Hannah leaves with a peace because she knows that she has just been heard by God. And so, moving on, some time passes, right? And God answers Hannah. Hannah conceives and gives birth to a son, and she names him Samuel. And the name Samuel means God has heard, which is so cool, right? And so, being true to her word, she fulfills this vow that she made to God. After Samuel is weaned, she brings him back to the tabernacle and says, I prayed for a child, and this is, the Lord has granted me what I asked of him, and so now I am giving my son to the Lord. And this just blows my mind because the very thing that she prayed for, and she longed for, and she wept for, she gives back to God, right? And it's not just a moment of surrender, it's actually a moment of worship for Hannah. And I think this is so significant because oftentimes, we can remove ourselves from the habit of prayer, remove ourselves from making prayer something that is habitual and something that we do as an act of worship and something that we do consistently with God, and we make it something that we do when we want something, right? But how many of us have ever prayed a so that prayer and said God, if you do this for me, then I will do this. Or can you do this so that I can do that, right? God, if you will give me this job, I'll start tithing. Okay? Or God, if you will give me somewhere better to live, then I will make sure that I start creating better habits in my life. Or God, if you get me in a healthy relationship, I will make sure that we don't sin. And then, we always make these commitments, but how many times do we actually follow through with them, right? And in contrast to Hannah's situation, this is not just her giving up a bad habit or paying some tithe, right? This is her giving up her son, her child, right? And this is a complete moment of surrender and obedience to God because he gave her this and she very quickly returns it back to him. And so then in 1 Samuel 2, we get Hannah's prayer of praise, something that is sometimes even called the Song of Hannah. And so she begins, my heart rejoices in the Lord my horn is lifted high. And then she says, there is no one holy like the Lord, there is no one beside you, there is no rock like our God. And so she is celebrating the God that doesn't do things as man would do. God who flips the script. God who does things in his own way. God who blesses, but then God who is also receptive of our blessings, right? Receptive of us when we are giving back. And so, this God, he brings down the proud and he lifts up the humble and he gives children to the barren and he raises the poor from the dust and he does all these things. And Hannah's story is so significant and sounds so familiar to us because centuries later, Mary, who is the mother of Jesus, echoes Hannah's words in her own song in Luke 1. And Hannah's testimony becomes part of the worship language of Israel for generations, which is so significant. And so there are a couple of things that I take away from Hannah's story. And I pray that you can too, because her story is so impactful as a woman of God, but also just as people of God, right? Hannah's obedience and what it meant and what her legacy became, because, we see Samuel and who he was and the things that he did and how significant it was that she was willing to entrust God with her son. And God used her son against the odds of everything around him to become someone who is such an important part of God's story, right? And so some things that we see from Hannah's story that really stick out to me is that God welcomes honest prayer, right? When we get this depiction of Hannah's prayer, she was praying in such a way that made Eli assume maybe she was drunk, right? Hannah did not fake it in this moment with God. She brought the things that she was carrying. She brought her bitterness, her tears, her suffering, the things that she was walking through. And that was the kind of prayer that God responded to. And so I think sometimes we kind of assume God can only answer our prayers when they're these like polished prayers or these well-written words, or we've got it all put together. But Hannah shows us that like God is seeking the truth, like our true hearts, our true worship, our true prayers. He's not asking us to come to him with something that's like fully refined or fully written out. Like he just wants us to be real with him and just talk to him. And it's so significant in his story that God welcomed these honest prayers. And the next thing that was really significant to me is that in her situation, her peace actually came before her provision. And, it says her face was no longer downcast. Hannah's face, her demeanor actually changed before her circumstances did, right? And I think there's a temptation to remain in the same attitude or have the same demeanor or whatever until our situation changes or until we get whatever it is that we want. But Hannah actually went against that. Hannah actually changed her mindset, changed her attitude, changed her everything before she even received the blessing. And so that's the kind of peace that, only comes from God, and the kind that Paul talks about in Philippians 4, the peace that surpasses understanding. And it's so significant that she was able to receive the peace of God when she had not even yet received the blessing or the gift, and how different that might look for us if rather than waiting for the blessing to fall in our lap, to change our attitude or to change our perspective, if we started walking in peace or we started to receive the peace from God before we've even received anything. And so the next thing is that her surrender was her worship. And so Hannah didn't just cling to this blessing that she was given, but she actually released it. And in releasing it, God then multiplied it, because through Samuel's ministry, Israel found leadership, kings were anointed, and the stage was set for David, who would eventually lead to Jesus, right? And so in her surrender, she made such a long-lasting impact that setting the stage for the rest of the story of Israel and God's people and Jesus, how different would it have looked if Hannah was not obedient and Hannah didn't surrender? But she did, right? And so through her, all of these things came. The next thing that I saw in Hannah's story is that our pain can sometimes be someone else's encouragement. Hannah's story didn't just stay Hannah's story, right? It became scripture. Her prayer became scripture. Her song became worship for generations with their people. And today her faith that we can reflect on still points us to the God who hears, or God hearing our prayers, or God being able to see us as who we are in our moments of despair and crying out in prayer, that our pain can become someone else's encouragement. And now as we are still impacted by Hannah's story and this surrender that she made and all of the things that she did, how that might look to someone else as an image of God, what our surrender might look like in someone else's life. And so Hannah's story is one that is so significant to me because, she wasn't a queen or a prophet or a warrior. She was a mother, and she was a woman who trusted God with her deepest pain, but also trusted him equally with her greater joy, right? She came to him when she was lacking and didn't have and felt hopeless, but then she also returned back to him what she did have and what she had been blessed with. And so through her obedience, she raised one of the greatest prophets in Israel's history, and her legacy reminds us that sometimes the most world-changing acts of faith happen not in these grand battles, but just in obedience and surrender and in quietly trusting God, right? And so it's so important to me, it's so significant, and I really love reading and sharing this story, and that is the story of Hannah, who was and is a woman of the word. So I really hope that this episode was impactful to you guys and it gave you guys some insight like it did to me studying it. And I'm super excited to continue the next few weeks of this series and sharing women of the word and why their stories are so important and so impactful. Make sure that you guys stay tuned in by following the Kingdom Culture Podcast on Instagram, as well as the Renew Network, and follow whatever you're listening on, whether it's Spotify or Apple or YouTube. Whatever you're listening on, give it a follow so that you can stay tuned in to future episodes. And until next time, you guys be blessed.